Mount St. Helens, Washington, May 21st, 1950. A 32-year-old skier named Joe Carter breaks away from his climbing party near a gorge called Ape Canyon and vanishes without a trace. 75 searchers. 5 days. Helicopters over the tree line. They find his ski tracks. They find a discarded box of camera film in the snow. They do not find him. They never will. Not his body, not his skis, and not the camera he carried down that mountain to take a single photograph. And years later, one of the men who searched hardest for him would go on the record with an answer that has haunted this case ever since. He said the apes got him. This is the disappearance of Joe Carter. And to understand why an experienced mountaineer would say something like that out loud, you have to understand where Carter vanished and what that place was already famous for. Joe Carter was not a tourist. He was 32 years old, an experienced mountaineer, and a member of the National Ski Patrol, the people trained to find the lost and rescue the injured on exactly this kind of terrain. He had worked at the Milwaukee Ski Bowl for years. He knew snow, he knew mountains, he knew, better than almost anyone on that slope, how to stay alive in high country. And on this day, he had climbed one of the most infamous mountains in the Pacific Northwest, a place that already carried a dark reputation long before he ever set foot on it. The mountain was Mount St. Helens, and the gorge that Joe Carter skied toward that morning had a name that most people, even then, said with a slight unease. They called it Ape Canyon. To understand why that name matters, you have to go back 26 years before Joe Carter ever arrived. In the summer of 1924, 5 gold prospectors were working a claim deep in the wilderness on the flanks of Mount St. Helens. Their names were Fred Beck, Gabe Lefevre, John Peterson, Marion Smith, and Marion's son, Roy. They had built a small cabin by hand, a base to work from while they mined. They were hard men, used to the wilderness, used to being alone in country where no one would hear them call for help. The nearest town was miles away over rough ground. Out here, they were on their own. According to the account that later ran in newspapers across Washington and Oregon, the strangeness did not begin all at once. In the days before the worst night, the men said they had heard things. A shrill, peculiar whistling that seemed to pass from one ridge to another, as if something were signaling across the canyon. A heavy thumping sound, like something striking its own chest out in the timber. And then they began finding footprints near the claim, large ones, shaped almost like a man's but wrong in the proportions. Then came the night that gave the canyon its name. It started with rocks. Large stones began striking the cabin from the darkness outside, hammering the walls and the roof. The men grabbed their rifles and looked out, and what they said they saw has been argued about ever since. They described tall, hair-covered creatures, ape-like, upright, moving in the trees around the cabin on all sides. The men called them mountain devils. The miners fired into the dark. The attacks would stop, then start again minutes later, as if whatever was out there simply withdrew and regrouped. This went on, they said, through much of the night. At one point, the men claimed one of the creatures reached a long arm through a gap in the cabin wall and groped for an axe hanging inside. And they had to lunge to stop it from pulling the tool out into the dark. Fred Beck claimed that when there was finally light enough to move, he fired at one of the creatures standing near the edge of the gorge and watched it topple over the rim and fall into the canyon below. By daybreak, the men had had enough. They abandoned the claim and hiked out of the wilderness, and they told their story. It reached the newspapers, and on July 16, 1924, it appeared in the Oregonian. The story became a sensation. Newspapers as far away as Boston picked it up. People called it the Great Ape Hunt, and armed men drove out towards Spirit Lake hoping to bag one of the creatures for themselves. The Oregonian ran a follow-up the same week that pushed the story somewhere stranger still. A Klallam tribal editor named York Totsky offered a different reading of what the miners had met. He said northwestern tribes recognized the description. He called them the Sihatik, a race of hair-covered giants, 7 to 8 feet tall, said in the old accounts to hunt by hypnotism and to throw their voices like ventriloquists, and long believed to be all but extinct. Whatever you make of that, it tells you how quickly this thing grew. Within days, a rock throwing in the dark had become front-page talk of a lost race of giants. And the gorge where it all supposedly happened got the name it still carries today, Ape Canyon. Now, it is important to be honest about this story, because the people who made this channel worth watching are the ones who want the truth, not just the thrill. The 1924 incident was investigated at the time, and it did not hold up well. Two Forest Service rangers, J.H. Huffman and William Welch, went out to the site. They climbed down into the supposedly inaccessible canyon where the wounded creature was said to have fallen, and they found nothing at the bottom. No body, no blood, no sign anything had gone over the edge at all. Then they looked at the famous footprints. The rangers demonstrated how those tracks could be faked using nothing more than the knuckles and the heel of a human hand pressed into the dirt. They also noted that the enormous rocks said to have been hurled at the cabin were sitting right there at the scene, and could just as easily have been placed by the miners themselves to back up the tale. Their verdict was blunt. The gorilla men were a myth. There is an even simpler explanation that surfaced almost immediately. Not long after the story broke, a group of boys from Portland came forward and said they had found the miners' cabin and been chased off at gunpoint. A nearby YMCA summer camp on Spirit Lake had a long tradition among its young campers of hurling pumice stones down into the canyon, apparently never realizing anyone was camped at the bottom. The acoustics of those narrow walls, which pinch to as little as 8 feet across at one point, can twist ordinary sounds into something that does not seem human at all. Rocks in the dark, distorted voices, bouncing of stone, 5 tired men far from home, some of them known to dabble in spiritualism and seances. It is not hard to see how a night like that becomes a monster. So the origin of Ape Canyon may well be nothing more than teenagers and echoes. And yet the miners never took it back. Fred Beck and the others walked away from a valuable gold claim and never returned to work it. And decades later, in 1967, Beck put his account into a book with a title that left no room for doubt about what he believed. He called it, "AI Fought the Ape Men of Mount St. Helens." Whatever really happened in that canyon, those men carried it as truth to the ends of their lives. But here is what matters for our story. By 1950, none of the skepticism mattered to the culture of the mountain. The rangers' verdict was old news. The legend was set. Ape Canyon was, in the minds of many, the home of something, and that was the ground Joe Carter skied onto. It began on a warm, clear Sunday. Carter had joined a climbing party of around 20 people from Seattle for an ascent of Mount St. Helens. The day looked perfect. Blue sky, good snow, an experienced group. They climbed up the mountain to a landmark called Dog's Head, sitting near the 8,000-foot level. From there, the plan was simple: clip into their skis and ride back down. Carter told the group he wanted to go first. He would ski down ahead of them, get into position off to the side, and photograph the rest of them as they came down toward the timberline. It was the kind of thing a confident skier does without a second thought. He pushed off and dropped below the others, out of their line of sight. And that was the last time anyone saw Joe Carter alive. Up at Dog's Head, the rest of the group gave him his lead, then started down one at a time, tracing the lines he had cut into the snow. They rode the payoff of the long climb, following his tracks toward the timberline, expecting at any moment to see him off to the side with his camera raised, catching them as they came. When they reached the spot where he should have been standing, he was not there. Instead, they found a small box for camera film, discarded in the snow, at the exact place he had stopped to set up his shot. And they found his ski tracks, leading on down the mountain, away from where he was ever supposed to go. This is where the story splits into two very different versions, and I want to give you both because the difference between them is the difference between a tragedy and a legend. The version that made this case famous came years later, more than a decade after Carter vanished. It appeared in an August 1963 newspaper article and was carried further in 1966 when it was reprinted in a book by a man named Roger Patterson, who the very next year would film the most famous piece of Bigfoot footage ever shot. That is the current this story got swept into. At the center of that version is a well-known Portland mountaineer named Bob Lee, a member of the exclusive Alpine Club, a man with real Himalayan expeditions to his name. Lee said he had been part of the search. In Lee's telling, Carter's tracks showed something deeply wrong. He said the skier had thrown himself down the mountain in a wild, death-defying dash, taking chances no skier of his skill would ever take unless something was terribly wrong or unless he was being pursued. Lee said Carter jumped over 2 or 3 large crevasses. He said he was going, in his words, like the devil down the slope, as though he were running from something. And Lee said something else, the line that has kept this case alive for decades. Speaking of himself and 2 other searchers, Dr. Otto Trott and Lee Stark, he said they came to a conclusion. In his own words, they finally decided that the apes got him. The apes got him. A searcher, on the record, naming the creatures of Ape Canyon as the answer. Lee also described the strange feeling that hung over the search. The sense, out there in the canyon, that they were being watched. That is the version that turned Joe Carter into folklore, and you can see why. It has everything. The frantic tracks, the crevasse jumps, the vanished man, and a respected mountaineer willing to say out loud that something inhuman was responsible. But almost all of that high strangeness comes from one man, telling the story more than 13 years after it happened. And when you go back to what was actually printed at the time, Bob Lee's name does not appear in it at all. Neither of the newspaper articles written during the search in 1950 mentions him. That does not prove he was not there. 75 people were involved, and it is entirely possible he was one of them. But it does mean the most dramatic details of this case, the chase, the panic, the apes, all trace back to a single voice recorded over a decade later and cannot be checked against anyone else. But there is another version. The one from 1950, written while the search was still going on, and it is quieter and sadder, and it deserves to be heard too. 2 newspapers covered the search at the time. They do not entirely agree with each other, which tells you how much confusion surrounded the case from the very beginning. The Madera Tribune on May 23rd gave Carter's age as 18 and reported that a helicopter was being sent to help search for him. The San Bernardino Sun, 2 days later, gave his age as 32 and called him an experienced mountaineer. They could not even agree on how old the missing man was. That second paper, the San Bernardino Sun, printed on May 25th, under a headline about searchers failing to find a diabetic skier, added a detail that the famous legend leaves out entirely. Joe Carter was diabetic, and he had gone into the wilderness with only about 1 day's supply of insulin. That single fact changes the shape of everything. In 1950, managing diabetes was far harder than it is today. There were no quick blood meters, no easy way to test your levels in the field. Insulin came in glass vials, and syringes were glass too, the kind of thing that shatters in a hard fall on a mountain. A diabetic man, alone, in freezing high country, low on insulin, or with nothing left to inject, is a man on a clock. And low blood sugar does something else that matters here. It can cloud judgment, blur coordination, and confuse a person, even an expert, into decisions that make no sense from the outside. The kind of decisions that might look, in a set of tracks, like panic. And the contemporary account of his tracks does not describe a panicked flight at all. It says his tracks near Ape Canyon indicated he had simply turned and walked into total wilderness during the previous day. It says he appears to have taken off his skis deliberately and continued on foot. A man moving with purpose, not fleeing in terror. No creature is mentioned, no pursuit. Just a skilled outdoorsman who, for reasons no one will ever fully know, left his group and walked into country he could not walk back out of. The search for him was enormous. As many as 75 people combed the canyon from one end to the other for 5 straight days. Helicopters were brought in. They followed his tracks until the deep forest swallowed them, and then there was nothing more to follow. After roughly 2 weeks, the search was called off. Joe Carter was never found. Not his body, not his skis, and not his camera. To this day, he is still missing. So what actually happened to Joe Carter? Over 75 years, the possibilities have narrowed to a handful, and it is worth walking through them honestly. The first is the simplest: exposure and his condition. A diabetic man, low on insulin, becomes disoriented as his blood sugar drops, wanders off the sensible route, takes off his skis, and pushes deeper into terrain he cannot survive without help. It fits the contemporary reporting almost perfectly. The trouble is that it asks us to believe an experienced ski patrolman simply walked away from his own group for no reason anyone ever established. The second is a fall. Ape Canyon is a real and dangerous gorge, in places pinching to just 8 feet across, with steep, broken walls. If Carter went over an edge or down into a crevasse in country that rugged, his body could have come to rest somewhere. No searchline would ever reach. It would explain why 75 people over 5 days found nothing. But his tracks, by the contemporary account, led away from the canyon rim into the timber, not over it. The third is something the newspapers of the day quietly raised and then dropped: foul play, or a man who chose to disappear. It has almost nothing behind it, and nearly everyone who has looked at the case sets it aside. But in a disappearance this total, it never fully goes away. And the fourth is the one that gave this story its long life: that whatever the miners said they met in 1924 was still out there in 1950, and that it, not the cold and not the terrain, is the reason Joe Carter skied down that slope and never stopped. There is no evidence for it that would satisfy a court or a coroner. It rests entirely on a set of tracks, a feeling of being watched, and one searcher's conviction. And still, generation after generation, it is the theory people come back to. So we are left standing between these possibilities, and we have to be honest about which parts are solid and which parts are smoke. Here is what is genuinely true. A real man, an expert mountaineer, and a member of the ski patrol vanished on Mount St. Helens in 1950 and was never seen again. 75 people could not find him. His camera was never recovered. And a respected searcher went on the record years later saying he believed the apes of Ape Canyon were responsible. And here is what honesty requires us to add. The dramatic version, the chase, the fleeing skier, comes to us more than a decade after the fact, from a single storyteller in the middle of the era when Bigfoot was becoming a national obsession. The men who wrote it down in 1950, while the snow was still being searched, described something far more ordinary and far more heartbreaking. A diabetic man, out of medicine, who walked into the trees and did not come back. The mountain devils of Ape Canyon may be nothing more than a name. Rangers found no evidence. Skeptics point to campers and echoes. The whole legend may rest on a foundation of teenage pranks and canyon acoustics. But legends are stubborn things, and there is a reason this one refuses to die. Because when you strip away the arguments, one detail remains that no explanation has ever fully closed. A man went down that slope to take a single photograph. His friends found the empty film box in the snow. And his camera, the thing he carried specifically to capture what was in front of him that morning, went into Ape Canyon with him and never came out. Whatever was in front of Joe Carter's lens in his final moments, whatever he saw as he skied down toward the timberline of that mountain, went with him into the canyon that already bore the name of something monstrous. And it is still down there, somewhere on the slopes of Mount St. Helens in the gorge they named after the apes. A camera has been waiting 75 years to show us the last thing an experienced skier ever chose to point it at. We will probably never know what that was. But the searcher who looked hardest for Joe Carter already told us what he believed.